Hey guys, what's up? Today I am breaking down all things cyberpunk. And yes, I mean the genre, not the game, though try telling that to Google. But the question is, will this influx of hype ignite the genre, sending it skyrocketing into new heights of cookie-cutter pop culture? Or is it too dated to survive, doomed to be left behind as we tire of the 80s aesthetic? Or is cyberpunk the future of modern mythology?
Sometimes I'm like a whisper in a riot, but I grow stronger, keep
First things first, let's talk origins. Cyberpunk as a genre name was first coined in 1980 by Bruce Beck, who wrote a short story with that title. Now, there are cyberpunk-esque stories that predated the 80s, but it was the 80s that brought all the pieces together and gave them identity. And so, funny enough, many argue that Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Burning Chrome, as well as the original Blade Runner, are technically speaking precursors to the genre. Though William Gibson's book Neuromancer, which Cyberpunk 2077 is based on, did come out in 1984, and so it benefits from full claim over the genre label, which is good given it's largely viewed as the blueprint of the genre overall.
The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel.
William Gibson.
William Gibson.
William Gibson.
Neuromancer.
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 William Gibson, a man who many see as the savior of science fiction.
Because despite not coining the word and coming in a little bit late to the game, William Gibson is considered by many to be the father of cyberpunk. Because at the end of the day, genre assumptions and expectations come not from the stories at the forefront of the genre, but rather from the stories labeled with that genre that managed to claw their way into the forefront of pop culture.
William Gibbons is a genius.
So when it comes to the genre label, there's a hesitation to assign it to stories written in the 70s. It's handed out like strip club ads on the Las Vegas Strip to any sci-fi story released in the 80s, and then each decade after, the label assignment gets a little bit trickier. For example, many argue that Blade Runner 2049 isn't cyberpunk. Well, many claim that Mr. Robot, which aired in its setting year of 2015, is. Now, why is that? And spoiler alert, post-cyberpunk isn't the answer. But before we can get to that, we have to talk Cyberpunk Basics. Cyberpunk is a slippery genre, where most genres have large, hand-wavy definitions that catch countless stories in their net. Cyberpunk shifts at the speed of tech and current societal fears, and so it's often hard to nail down. In the preface to the book, Burning Chrome, Bruce Sterling calls this genre a 1-2 combination of low-life and high-tech. And that's about as specific and agreed upon definition as you're gonna get. Cyberpunk is an earthbound speculative fiction, and it fits under the umbrella of sci-fi. The word cyber relates to the focus on advanced tech and science and software.
I needed a buzzword. Buzzwords are very important. I think I came up with cyberspace before I had the imaginary technology for it. If I'd called it data space, perhaps none of this would have happened.
Now, the other half of the word, punk, relates to punk subculture. But remember, cyberpunk as a term was coined in 1980. So I'm not talking about Green Day, knee-high Converse, guitars, spiked bracelets, straightened hair, Hot Topic, or any of those other, pop punk things that certain people engaged in their youth. The word comes from the origins of punk and is meant to represent radical change in social order, anti-corporatism, and a push for nonconformity. The punk side represents the dystopian undertones of rebels and hackers taking on the megacorps and other forms of OP societal control. It's also worth noting that cyberpunk has a strong film noir influence, often called neo-noir when used in futuristic settings. And you can see this influence in the anti-heroes, in the cynical tone, detective characters, mystery, moral ambiguity, and those sexy-ass rain scenes that we all love so very much. It is always raining in film noir because black pavement looks cooler, and it explains the empty streets. In cyberpunk, this came with a super extra bonus because the genre's signature neon signage, paired with the wet pavement, makes for scenes that would make Brandon Wolfell weep. Okay, so that, paired with the homage paid to the neon aesthetic of the 80s, explains the presence of all of the flashy signs. But why are all of the signs covered in Asian characters? Why is ramen the go-to food in cyberpunk future? Well, it comes back to historic fears painted on a futuristic canvas. The main reason that cyberpunk is so hard to nail down is that its worlds and narratives are meant to be representations and exaggerations of our current fears as a society. So many cyberpunk stories happen 20 minutes into the future, which means a time frame that feels futuristic, but only in a few choice elements. For example, Big Hero 6 is 20 minutes in the future, and so you have Baymax and badass nanotech and some kind of advanced fighting robots in a Tokyo SFO mashup, but we're still relying on standard cars for transportation. Hey, yes, I'd like to know what happened to Tesla's self-driving car tech, and why are we still using subways 100 years in the future?
People who write about imaginary futures, if they get a few hits, are marketed as though they were seers.
William Gibson is a modern-day oracle.
We're not, as my colleague Bruce Sterling used to like to say rather smugly, we're charlatans.
But as much as we might blame lack of creativity for these half-futuristic, half-contemporary worlds, the reasoning is actually rooted in justified narrative decisions. These stories show only a handful of advancements because they want you to focus on said advancements. And the elements that are futuristic are almost always an exaggeration or representation of the fears of society at the time.
When people write imaginary futures, they're never about the future. They can only be about the moment in which they were written and the known history before that.
And that exaggeration part exists for more than just fictional intrigue. If the fears represented are close enough to our world so as to feel like parallels, if they feel impending and real, our craving for escapism can actually drive us away from the story. I learned that the hard way this year when my readership for my dark virus-based dystopian book fell. Because, things happening in the world. The precursors to cyberpunk, the stories that birthed the genre, released in the early 70s, which were a time of skyrocketing crime and urban decay. And so the genre focused on national malaise.
Gangs spread crack and violence across America.
This is your brain on drugs.
I just don't know when it's gonna stop.
The 1980s introduced the West to megacorps and Japan with a backdrop of the tail end of the Cold War.
So much in the 80s, we consumed so much.
The me and more generations consuming, competing. I guess the 80s gave new meaning to the phrase survival of the fittest.
Japanese cars invaded our roads, and Japanese companies swallowed our companies.
The idea that Japan was about to own the whole world was really esoteric, but it was there.
And so these were the societal fears that dominated that decade of cyberpunk. But since that was the decade that defined the genre, these elements became forever woven into the cyberpunk identity. It's also worth noting that another factor could be that Tokyo, with its skyscrapers, massive glowing signs, and overpopulation, offers the closest real-world setting to what we logically imagine cyberpunk to be, meaning many cyberpunk writers derive inspiration from images of Tokyo, and naturally other aspects of the culture end up woven in. And then we move into the 90s cyberpunk, and some of the 80s aesthetic and societal fears stuck around, rooted too deeply in the genre definition to be truly left behind. But we did see the next wave of fears. The Matrix, for example, came out in '99, right before Y2K. It surrounds our fears of tech, and so the advancements are all centered around tech controlling humans. And these fears stretched into the early 2000s. And then we have our current wave, the 2010s. And here we see our newest round of fears, primarily income inequality and climate change. But then we come back to the question, is Mr. Robot really cyberpunk? Sure, it exaggerates modern problems a bit, and it centers around hackers taking on megacorps, we have anti-heroes, gritty and cynical views, but it's set in 2015. And as dystopian as New York looks to the eyes of those who have never visited, it is ultimately still contemporary New York. And yet people will argue for the story. And then you have Blade Runner 2049 with its film noir elements, future setting, megacorps, high-tech, low-life, and yet many argue against it counting. So what counts as cyberpunk? It seems to come down to aesthetics versus story. Many feel that since the genre is born from the 80s cyberpunk aesthetic, that it's a genre requirement. Many even place these visuals above the story. And I don't want to say that stance is wrong, but I think that it's a stance that will lead to the stagnation and death of the genre if we keep pushing for it. Sure, the 80s aesthetic has some charm, and nostalgia and curiosity will lead to us embracing it for a while longer, but the visuals will age much more quickly than the questions at the foundation of the story. And I think that without modernization, the visuals will soon become too distracting and cliche for the story to hit home. I do think that Blade Runner 2049 did an excellent job at paying homage to the 80s origins while still modernizing the visuals on all levels. But the thing about Blade Runner 2049 is the story. Yes, we have Megacorps, but the core plot is all about Kay's internal journey to an enlightenment that has little to do with taking on Wallace Corp in the traditional cyberpunk dystopian sense. And many feel that the punk aspect is lost in Blade Runner 2049. I think those people are wrong, but I can see why. The anti-conformist core of the story is less flashy than people are used to, and I think that it leads to it being lost, especially to those who only watch the film once and don't watch it 10 times in a row and read the script to analyze it for a long-ass video. But ultimately, what makes people label Mr. Robot as cyberpunk, while arguing that Blade Runner 2049 is not, is the focus of the surface narrative. Speaking of genre identity, it's actually cyberpunk that started the trend of genres with the name punk, and so more arguments of what counts and doesn't count can lead to the application of alternate labels belonging to sister genres. My personal favorite, as far as naming goes, is apuncalypse. Even the word looks ridiculous. I love it. So let's talk about some relevant sister genres. The last of which is hugely underappreciated, and honestly, if cyberpunk dies, this last one will probably be the next big trend. First up, we have nanopunk. This is still in its infancy, and whether or not it takes off will depend largely on how our nanotech advances. As soon as nanotech starts to feel truly dangerous, this will explode. If that never happens, it will die off. For now, it doesn't even have a TV tropes page. Next, we have post-cyberpunk. Post-cyberpunk is the answer to cyberpunk, and unsurprisingly, it came after. Whereas cyberpunk is dark, edgy, gritty, post-cyberpunk is more hopeful and tries to paint the megacorps and the rebels in more of a gray color. This covers films such as Ready Player One. It's a black book, you can't even tell it's Ready Player One. It checks cyberpunk marks on paper, but it has none of the feel of the genre, and so it falls into this new category. And then we have my personal favorite, which I really want to see explode, and that's biopunk. I know, plot twist. So biopunk is like cyberpunk, but with a focus on bioengineering and the dangers associated with bioadvancements. So biopunk is an interesting example of a smaller genre that's often lumped together with cyberpunk. Sometimes these stories can feel so cyberpunk that no one argues the placement. Other times, not so much. For example, BioShock is technically biopunk, and that identification feels perfect. You have tech, but no programs or hackers. It's in the past, and most of the fictional elements are wrapped into biological advancement. But you have all of the punk elements that cyberpunk has. But on the other side, you have Sony's Edge, which is one of the shorts contained in Love, Death, and Robots. That has tech and bio advancements, and it gets placed in both, but it would fit better in biopunk if only that genre was more of a thing. And I think it will become more of a thing. We're already cloning animals and growing meat, and it's only a matter of time before societal fears surrounding that grow strong enough to uplift a whole genre. But then, what will happen to cyberpunk? These can obviously coexist, but cyberpunk is more tired. It's middle-aged from the time it hit pop culture. Can we keep it up? And so we come to the question, is cyberpunk too dated to survive? I was born in the 90s, so I don't have much exposure to 80s aesthetics beyond a few cult classical movies and the first 2 seasons of Stranger Things. I mean, hell, I barely remember the 90s. So this lack of nostalgia does color my stance a little differently from the generation before me. But for me personally, the fashion aesthetic works, both on an intrigue level, but also in terms of logic. Humans are creative, but not enough to make all new fashions every generation. And so we borrow from old trends and refresh old styles and ideas. And so to me, it's perfectly logical that 80s aesthetics could exist in a society 20 minutes into the future, and in fact, I'd argue that further away from the 80s we get, the more natural it feels to see 80s elements in a futuristic setting. Music and media references are a little more on the edge. Newer generations can't relate, and so the references can cause a sense of disconnect. But the real aspect we need to keep an eye on is the infrastructure. For example, ads. Those flashy neon signs? Surely those work just as well now as in the 80s, right? I mean, after all, they look so damn pretty. But that's the problem. They weren't created to look pretty. When Cyberpunk first emerged, the giant neon signs, the in-your-face advertisements, the pop-ups from hell that could follow you as you walk, these were all meant to represent oppression and the dangers of capitalism. They were supposed to invoke fear, or at the very least, discomfort.
You know, adverts used to be really long, then they got shorter and shorter, and you just have all this information flying at you, and it makes you feel, you know, your nerves are raw, you're on edge, and that's the same. It's the same feeling and the same mood. That's what William Gibson creates.
But now it's more like Las Vegas. We think of fun nightlife and excitement. We drooled over the thoughts of Night City portrayed on our screen in all of its ray-traced glory. But then, how did the original message of these get so lost? Is it just the psychology of how flashy lights shoot right to our dopamine center, or has capitalism won? I think this is actually in large part because modern ads just suck so much. Like, just let me look at the cornmeal pizza crust recipe. I don't need a life story paired with a Domino's ad. Flashy lights are much nicer. Give me a sexed up Titan Joy any day. I'd love to hunt for the microscopic X on that ad. But at the end of the day, I think the risk of the genre becoming dated lies much more within the recycling of old societal fears and 80s stances. Which brings us to the question, can cyberpunk become a canvas for modern mythology? In the preface to the book Burning Chrome, Bruce Sterling says, "Science fiction writers can play with big ideas because the garish motley of our pulp origins makes us seem harmless." Though the foundations of cyberpunk are a bit tired, the core that the genre thrives in, it's right to explore all of the deep questions, from the age-old questions of the soul and the afterlife, painted onto AI and digital immortality, to new questions exploring cybernetics and, hey, maybe even some anthropomorphism. I mean, the list of topics that fit the genre is endless. At the end of the day, I believe that cyberpunk could easily be one of the main canvases in which we explore modern myth. And in fact, with the right approach, it could be the best genre suited to it. But for that to work, writers have to push the bounds of the genre and ensure that the aesthetics, symbolism, and advancements can speak to the current age of society. We need to put away the checklist of what counts and doesn't count, and just let our stories thrive, using the old genre as inspiration, but never a roadmap. And that was it for this video. Alethea is coming to audiobook very soon. The audiobook is so good. The narrator is amazing. If you want to support me, you can always join my Patreon. There's a whole Discord chat. It's pretty cool over there too. And thank you so much for watching. As always, I will see you in the next video.
Say you believe in your belief.